Bruchim Aboyim to the second in the series of lectures, shiurim, that are entitled The Oral Tradition of the Written Law. Last time we introduced a new concept, actually not a new concept, it's actually due to the Amora Reish Lakish, who says in Gittin Taf Samach Amud Aleph, Torah Chasuma Nitna, that in fact, in the course of the 40 years, from the time of the giving of the Torah to the time of its completion and of Moshe Rabbeinu, there was an oral tradition, which was, according to Reish Lakish, later incorporated into a text, a written text. And this is the opinion of Reish Lakish, and we went into detail with. Now, it's very, very important. I want to emphasize again the concept we introduced. According to Reish Lakish, there was no text, not even in the oral sense. You know, when people think about an oral tradition, they invariably think about an oral text which hasn't yet been written down. And this is certainly true of, according to many opinions, of the Mishnah and the Gemara, that in fact the redaction preceded perhaps by a few years, perhaps by a few hundred years, perhaps according to Hashkafa Circle Datka, maybe 600-700 years. It's actually it's writing down. In other words, it's a commitment to a written document. But here we're speaking about an oral tradition without a oral text. In other words, the Torah, which I've asserted actually according to Rav Shua Goin before Yesi ben Yoyaza, was in fact taught without a transmission of an oral text, but rather was taught. Every Rebbe would somehow impart his novella to his students, his chidushim to his talmidim. And in fact, this is Reish Lakish's understanding of the process by which the Torah was apprehended through the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, ba'aspek lora hami'ira, but the text of the Chumash was actually committed to writing and was actually formed at the end of the 40 years. Now, the fact is that this is an interesting opinion of Reish Lakish. Certainly our interpretation might seem novel, but the fact is that this is actually an assumption which actually pervades all of Chazal. And there are many cases which we encounter statements of Chazal that, in my opinion, without this concept of an oral tradition preceding the writing of the text, that in fact the Chazal, in my opinion, are in fact unintelligible. And let me give you an example. Now, even though I'm not sure exactly at what point people listen to this shir during the year, but last Shabbos was Parshat Vayera, and since today is Monday, so the Gemara in Gittin says that Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday belong to the Shabbos previous, so we could still consider ourselves still within the Parshat Vayera. And there's a pasuk in Bereishit, in Vayera, Perek Yud Ches, pasuk Chof. There it says, Vayema Hashem zakas doim v'amoira ki rabba, v'chatosam ki chavda ma'od. Kodesh Baruch Hu says that the cry of Sdom and Amoira is very much, and they're very sinful. The sins weigh very heavily. And then after Avram Avinu parts from the Malachim, so it says in Pasuk Chav Beis, this is Perek Yud Ches Pasuk Chav Beis, it says Vayivna Misham Anoshim, the people, the Malachim, parted from Avram Avinu, Vayelchu Stoima, and they went on to Stoim. V'Avram Avinu Omed Lefnei Hashem. Avram Avinu is still standing in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rashi brings a medrash. Rashi's medrash goes as follows. Rashi says, Oidenu Omed v'chulei. So says Rashi, V'haloi lo halach la'moed lefanav. Avram Avinu didn't go to stand in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'etzloi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to Avram Avinu. V'amar lo zakas doim v'amoira. In other words, Rashi understands the pasuk, Vayema Hashem zakas doim v'amoira, HaKadosh Baruch Hu came and appeared to Avram Avinu. Kiviyachol. So what does it say? Avram Oidenu Omed Lefnei Hashem. Right? Hayo lechtoiv Hashem Oidenu Omed Avram. It should have said HaKadosh Baruch Hu was still Omed Avram. HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to Avram Avinu. And Avram Avinu, he told Avram Avinu about the cry that comes out from Sdom. And then I guess in the intermittent time, Avram Avinu parts from the Malachim. So she should have said that Kadosh Baruch Hu is still Adon Avram. Ela tikkun soferim huza. Tikkun soferim. I'm not sure how this is translated, but actually this is I couldn't call it correction, but a style of the scribes. Right? Tikkun soferim huza. So of course, anyone who reads this Rashi, maybe this man is not everyone, but those of you who read this Rashi, so your eyes open up and said, what does it mean? Does it mean that the Torah was written by human beings who basically took a text and changed the text? So says I'm reading from the Gur Aryeh, Eina perush chas v'shalom. Chas v'shalom. It says the Gur Aryeh, Shah Sefer kosav kach b'Torah. Chas v'shalom, that his Sefer would actually somehow word the Torah appropriately in his own language. Chalila loy makach. This is in fact actually kefira. This is apikosis. And right? Ela perush, but what does it mean? Shah Torah kosva derech kavod klepe maila. The Torah spoke in a derech kavod. The Torah talked with respect when it spoke about a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Kamosha derech haseifim l'chtoiv derech kavod. In other words, it doesn't mean that Kadosh Baruch Hu was waiting for Avram Avinu, but rather Avram Avinu was waiting in front of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, standing in front of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, right? It says the Gur Aryeh, just like we say, for example, that the Torah speaks in the language of man. So this is like the Torah wrote in a way in which the soferim, in manner in which the soferim write. And therefore, Chazal say in Bereishit Rabbah, tikkun soferim hu. What is tikkun soferim hu? It is a tikkun, a change, a scribal change. I'm not sure how I translated it. This is similar to the way the scribes write. Okay, now, I'm not going to go into detail what does tikkun soferim mean. This is much ink has been spilt on this. There are many shitas, not only of Rishonim, but there are also what appears to be the interesting midrashim, measures tanchum, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into this, but let's in fact, actually, the Lech of the Rashba, which is brought in the I'm reading from the Sipsei Chachamim. This is brought in the Mizrachi. So the Rashba also says, "Hakavona chalila shoysifa shoysiro masha kosav b'Torah chas v'shalom," that the soferim added, subtracted to that was written in the Torah. Afilo ois achas chalila ela inyan tikkun sofer hu shem ditiku batzu lefi inyan kolach ve'echad min haksuvim mem she'ika kavona lo ha'isa kamo shenira mimasha kosav b'sefer. In other words, the intention is not the way it's written in the Torah. Ela tzad kavona acheret. It's interesting. The Rashba says a little bit more than the Gur Aryeh. That in fact, actually, the Torah intended, quote unquote, to say one thing, but said it in a different way. Okay, so in other words, the Rashba, Kedalka B'Kodesh, actually, in other words, he elaborates the fact that the concept of tikkun soferim means that the Torah somehow intended one idea, but said the idea in a different way. Expressed the idea in a different way. Okay? This is all Piak Vura. What I would like to say is that based upon what we've been saying, this notion, especially the way the Rashba phrases it, this notion, and even the way the Gur Aryeh phrases it, fits in very well to the idea of an oral tradition of the written text. The fact is that we have to distinguish the way things were apprehended through Nevuah, which we can identify with quote-unquote speech and oral transmission, and the way things are written. In other words, the Kiviyachol, because we have no way of understanding what the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu was, but in a rather concise way, we can say that somehow, if we can imagine that there are two levels, there's an oral transmission, and then there's a text. So therefore, we can say that the oral transmission certainly expressed the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Pirta Avram Avinu, informed him of the crimes of Sodom, and remained with Avraham Avinu until the Malachim left. And then Kodesh Baruch Hu was still with Avraham Avinu, still appearing to Avraham Avinu. But when the Torah was made into a text, it was written with what they call kavod kalapi maila, that Avraham Avinu Adon made Hashem. So in other words, the concept of tikkun soferim can be understood very clearly. We don't have to speak about chas v'sholom like the Rashba says, chas v'sholom like the Go'ayi says. We don't have to speak about the fact that perhaps some scribe added or subtracted from the Torah, right? But rather we can speak about the fact that the concept of tikkun soferim is a very good illustration of the notion of an oral transmission or an oral tradition which precedes the text. That's what I want to claim is the fundamental understanding of Chazal here. Okay, now there's other examples which I thought about, that there's many examples we could actually have an entire series of examples of where Chazal actually view the Torah as in fact actually a text which emerges from an oral transmission. But I just want to give another example how actually in fact a non-agadic example. It's a Tosefot in Bava Metzia, at the very beginning of Ezel Neshech, the 5th parak of Bava Metzia. It'll be a while before the Daf Yomi gets there, but when it gets there, you'll be prepared, and you'll tell your friends the Pshat in the Tosefot. In Samach Amud Beis, in Bava Metzia, so the Gemara says that the Torah issued 2 lavim, 2 prohibitions, on the prohibition of lending money with interest, money with ribis. So, and in fact, actually, these 2 prohibitions are identical prohibitions. In other words, a person lends money with interest, he's over, he transgresses 2 lavim, 2 prohibitions. So the Tosefot asks the question: if in fact the prohibitions are identical, why is the language of the Torah in each prohibition different? And that's what Tosefot says. In Samach Amud Beis, the second Tosefot on the Amud, Dibra Amaschel lama chilkam hakatuv la'avo la b'shnei lavim. So Tosefot asks the question: V'itema, should you ask the question? V'lama shina b'loshen? Why did the Torah change the lashon, change the language? If in fact the intention of the Torah is just to slap he who lends with usury, right, with 2 lavim, they're identical, why should the Torah change its lashon? Lech kasv'cha lo yisintin meneshech u'v'neshech lo yisintin och lecha. That's what the Tosefot asks the question. Why should there be a change? They're identical. As far as the oral laws, they're identical. As far as the written laws are identical. So Tosefot says, v'yesh leimar, and so we're forced to say, says Tosefot, kevich hutzach shnei lavim, since the Torah had to write 2 lavim, 2 prohibitions, orcha dekor, it's the derech of the pasuk, the derech of the scripture, the way of the scripture, lichtov loshen meshuna, to write a slightly different language, shuna yoser, it's nicer. In other words, whatever noah means, it's nicer to write a slightly different language. It'll be a little bit maybe poetic, whatever it is. Very incredible thing. What is this concept of shuna yoser? It's nicer language if you write a little bit differently. As if the Torah has to appeal to an aesthetic form of language in order to communicate to lavim. But, so in other words, Dal Sheni as much as you want, but according to what we're speaking about, the concept of an oral tradition preceding the text, I think the Tosefot is saying a very, very simple thing, is that in fact the transmission, the nevuah to Moshe Rabbeinu, the oral transmission, was that if a person lends his money with ribis, so therefore he is over, he transgresses 2 prohibitions. When the text was formulated, the text had to communicate these prohibitions, and the way in which the text communicates the 2 prohibitions has to be in such a way that there's a slight change in both clauses in the pasuk, because that's no yoser. Okay, in other words, there are many, many cases in the Gemara and the lashon of Rishonim, right, where Tosefot is assuming that there's a notion of an oral transmission, an oral law, which only at a later stage becomes redacted al pi hagvura into a written Torah, into a Torah shebechsav. Okay? Yeah.
It's early in the morning, but I don't understand how that Tosefot implies an oral tradition before the written tradition.
Because the Torah, where did the 2 lavim come from? The 2 lavim didn't emerge from the pasuk. The 2 lavim preceded the wording of the pasuk. The pasuk seems to be saying two lavim, but Chazal say it's exactly the same lav, even though one clause says kesef, one clause says oichel, but really it's the exact same lavim. There's enough kamina. So, in other words, it's not if in fact we're deriving the two lav with the two psukim, lavim should be different, but they're actually the same. So therefore, what there's a concept of two lavim. The nevuah to Moshe Rabbeinu imposed two lavim for exactly the same things.
So why couldn't that have happened at the same time? Why couldn't the Kadosh Baruch Hu...
Get to v'yado b'yado achas? Okay, but this is an explanation.
I mean, when Kadosh Baruch Hu gave Moshe Rabbeinu the
Well,
Torah,
Moshe-
with two psukim...
What's called giving the Torah? There's two stages.
Because you're assuming Reish Lakish, but let's imagine not like Reish Lakish.
Yeah.
Kadosh Baruch Hu hands Moshe Rabbeinu a sealed document with two psukim in it and says, you should know Moshe, the Torah Shabbat Pel, and this is that it's one love.
I understand that, but what the lashon is, since the Torah had to give two lavim, the Torah had to write a language which was nicer. There's a causality here.
Okay.
Look, that's why I understand it. Okay? Now, in fact, the very, very notion, actually, which I don't want to go into right now, but actually it's interesting that actually what's the notion of two lavim? It's actually, if you look at the Sugi in Samach Aleph and Bava Metzia, you'll see that actually the difference between what's called a kal v'chomer and a binyan av. A kal v'chomer you derive, let's say B from a pasuk A. So you start with pasuk A and derive it from B. But a binyan av, what you do is you take A and B and derive C. But usually C doesn't contain all of the attributes or the dinim of A and B. In a certain sense, a kal v'chomer is going from the text outwards, whereas a binyan av is going from the inwards to the text. In other words, a binyan av, in a certain sense, is an oral law which precedes the text. I'm going to go into this in detail, but that's the difference between a binyan av and a kal v'chomer. A kal v'chomer, one induces from the text. In the binyan av, one creates a priori or law, a din, on the basis of two lavim. And the Gemara in Samach Aleph, for example, in Bava Metzia, uses this as a way of determining that actually Lech sigzol is not needed, kipshuto in the Torah, because you already can derive that from the ribis and einah. And because of that, the Lech sigzol is speaking about oishek schar socher. If you look at Samach Aleph and Bava Metzia, so actually the notion of an oral law, saying the written law, is actually important in several of the midas. But this is not a shir on the Yud midas. Okay, now, up till now, we've been referring to the position of Reish Lakish, which is orality preceding text. What about Rabbi Yochanan? So Rabbi Yochanan says, Torah Megillah Nitna. And as Rabbi Sedley remarked last time, Megillah lived. The Rashi speaks about a sefer Bereishit, a sefer Noach. Your other last time was actually, I want to go back to it maybe another time. But in any case, so if Megillah didn't, so what is the Torah that we have in front of us? The Torah we have in front of us, perhaps it's just the series of Megillahs that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, but that can't be. Why can that be? Because there's a concept called Ein Mukta Me'ucha B'Chumash. There's a concept that the parashas in the Chumash are not arranged in historical order. So therefore, you can't say that Moshe Rabbeinu was just jotting down his nevuah in a notebook, in a diary, and what we get is just the series of thoughts over the 40 years. You can't say that because there's a concept of the Torah that the parashas are not in what's called historical order. So we have to say already from the concept Emuch Bukta B'Chumash, which is actually a concept in Chazal, and it's used by Rishonim, it's used by Chazal and Rishonim, that we have to say that at least when Moshe Rabbeinu, after Moshe Rabbeinu had written down the Megillahs, there was what's called a redaction. A redaction mean on a very simple level, taking the parashas and writing them down, right, in a different order. Now, what's the point of this redaction? So, this past week was Parshas Vayera, but I thought maybe, I'm not chas v'shalom trying to give a chumash here on ashkafacircle.com.
No, chas v'shalom.
Chas v'shalom, right? But in any case, what I thought actually is that I would look at the very interesting case of Ein Mucha Mukta Machumish that appears in Parshas Lecha, which is not this past Shabbos, but 2 Shabbosim ago. Now, what is Parshas Lecha? So there's a very, very interesting Gemara in Brachos, which everybody knows. Everyone knows Gemara in Brachos because they learned in the Daf Yomi. And Gemara says in Daf Zayin Amud Beis, folio 7, side B, in Brachos.
That from Daf Yomi. That was 3 months ago.
Okay. For those of you who gave up on the Daf Yomi, still remember Brachos. So anyway, so Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishim Hashem B'Yochai. It says Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Hashem B'Yochai. Miyayim Shabo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ha'olam. From the time that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man, right? From the time HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, Lo Haya Adam Shekari LaKadosh Baruch Hu Adon. There was no one who ever called HaKadosh Baruch Hu Adon. Ad Sheba Avram, right? Ad Sheba Avram, Avinu, with the correction with the Hagar of the Bach. Ad Sheba Avram, V'kara Adon, they called him Adon. Like it says, Shenema, Vayema Adonai Bama Edaki Irashena. Okay, so this is a very, very famous pasuk in Bereishit. It begins actually the bris ben ha-Betarim. It's in Perek Tezvav pasuk beis. Vayema Avram. I'm sorry. Right. I'm sorry. Perek Tezvav pasuk ches. Vayema Adonai Elokim Bama Eda Ki Irashena. That's the pasuk. So now Tosefot on the spot asks a kasha. Right? Freit Tosefot. Diba hamaskal haya Adam shekara Adon. V'it tema, says Tosefot. If you ask, Amay lo miyasi kra Adonai Elokim mati tenli shu kosav koidem. In other words, the pasuk that the Gemara brings, Vayema Adonai Elokim bama eda ki irashena, is in Perek Tezvav pasuk ches. However, right before that, there's a pasuk beis, Perek Tezvav pasuk beis. Vayema Avram Adonai Elokim mati tenli v'anochi hoylech hariri. The pasuk before that. In other words, the Gemara is speaking of Chazal, Rabbi Yochanan is speaking about is speaking about the first time that a person called the Kadosh Baruch Hu b'Shem Adnos, right? What? Why bring the second case? Bring the first case. The first case is in pasuk beis. So Tosefot says an incredible thing. Tosefot says, "V'yesh lama." Tosefot answers and says, "Shapashus lo'nemu b'keseder." The parshas are not in order. Ve'ein mukta mulchem b'Torah. In other words, the order of the parshas, the psuk and the parshas of the Torah, are not in historical order. Ve'zeh pasuk the ben ha-Betarim haya koydem Lech. So what Tosefot says that the pasuk ches, which really begins the bris ben ha-Betarim, right? Because after Avraham Avinu says, Vayema Adonai Elokim bama eda ki irashena, because Baruch Hu says, Vayema elav kacholi egla mishuleshes, ez mishuleshes, v'ayl mishulesh, v'soy v'goizal. That introduced the bris ben ha-Betarim. So Tosefot says the bris ben ha-Betarim was actually earlier. And Tosefot goes on, I'm going to go into the other Tosefot, there's not a Daf Yomi here. Tosefot actually goes on and says that actually the bris ben ha-Betarim took place several years before the milchama of the malachim of the kings. So it turns out, interesting enough, is that you have the milchama of the malachim, which is in Perek Yodalet. Then in Perek Tezvav, the Torah begins, Achad dvar ma'ila haya dvar Hashem el Avram b'machzeh leimor, and Rashi explains, and Tosefot quotes Rashi, that this is after the milchama. Avraham Avinu was afraid, perhaps there'll be retaliation. Al tira Avram anechi mogin lechaschacha habe ba'oit. And then Avram asks the question, Vayema Avram Adonai Elokim mati teli v'anochi Lech hariri. That's right. However, before that, 3 years of when the Torah begins in pasuk ches, Vayema Adonai Elokim b'ma eda ki irashena, that took place 3 years before the milchama. So the parshas are out of order. Okay, now The question is, why are the Parshas out of order? We're dealing here with the very simple redaction of the Parshas of the Chumash. Why are the Parshas out of order? Now, it could possibly be, one could say maybe there's the Megillas Avram Avinu she's referring to, but I think why the Parshas out of order? So, I thought, maybe perhaps it's a little bit more of a derech hadrush, but I'll say it anyway, that there's an interesting Gemara in Adon in Daf Lamed Beis. The Gemara asks the question, what was the chet of Avram Avinu that Klal Yisrael, that the Jewish people became avadim, became slaves in Mitzrayim? The Gemara asks in Lamed Beis Amalaf in the Adon. And in fact, there are three opinions, right? So one opinion is of Rabbi Yochanan. He took Talmud Chachamim and he drafted them into the army. Shmuel says, Avram Avinu questioned HaKadosh Baruch Hu when he said, Bama idaki irashena. And then there's a third opinion of Rabbi Yochanan himself, who says that as a wrote in the Milchama, right? Hilfish b'nei Adon likanes tachas kanfei hashchina. Avram Avinu did not. He was offered the prisoners by Melech's time, but Avram Avinu says, right? Ten yanev chus kach loch v'yok. Right. In other words, basically that he wasn't maklim tachas kanfei hashchina. Now, what's very, very interesting is that we see the three opinions. So the opinion of Shmuel seems to be clearly in the text of the Chumash, because Avram Avinu in Pasuk Ches asks, "Vayera Hashem Elokim b'ma idaki rashena," hifriz al amida, and immediately HaKadosh Baruch Hu presents him with the bris ben Absarim, and of course in the bris ben Absarim we have the nevuah of the Shibud of Mitzrayim. So clearly Shmuel is saying, what does the Bris Absalom have to do with Avram Avinu's B'mai Daki Rashena? But clearly Avram Avinu's question, right, was called Hafraza Alamida. So Shmuel's position is very, very clear from the text. But what's interesting is the other opinions of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan have to do with the war, with the Milchama. Vayera as Chanicha, he drafted the Brit Torah, or he wasn't Maknas Kamzik Shechina. These are things that have to do with the Milchama. How did Chazal know? How did Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan know that somehow these events which took place in the Milchama were the cause of the Shibud Mitzrayim? Not to mention the fact that according to the Tosefot, right, the Milchama is after Bris Ben Absarim. That's the question. Well, the answer is obvious. What's the answer? The answer is obvious. I'm insulting you to tell the answer. I'll tell you anyway. From the fact that the Torah wrote the Bris Ben Absarim after the Milchama, that's the raya of Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan, that clearly things that took place in the Milchama were the cause for the Shibud of Mitzrayim. So we see clearly in Chazal that they made use of Ein Muchel Mukdam B'Torah in order to express this very, very basic Yesod, this very, very important theme, that in fact the Shibud Mitzrayim is an extension of what we'd call the unfinished, uncompleted work of Avram Avinu. So the redaction, I'm calling quote unquote, of course is all Pi Gvura, but the redaction of the Parshas of the Torah was a way in which the Torah Shebachsav, Al Pi Nevuos Moshe Rabbeinu, is coming to communicate these important and fundamental truths of the Torah. And that's a very simple example. We'll get to, of course, to much more complicated examples, but that's a very simple example how the redaction of a text is being used to communicate an important principle. Okay? Okay. Now, given this, we see that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are expressing two aspects of the ksiva of the Torah, the way in which the Torah was written. that in fact, Reish Lakish is emphasizing the creation of a oral transmission which later is cemented into a text. And this oral transmission obviously is something which contains very, very important ideas, profound ideas. Of course, there's Teras Moshe. And then there's a second aspect of transmission where Moshe Rabbeinu is taking texts, the text of Nevuah, and redacting them. Now, it's very interesting that if we understand these two aspects, these two dimensions of Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah and Ksiva of the Torah, then we can understand a kasha I always had since I was a little boy in the Yud Gimel Ikum of the Rambam. I didn't ask this, I don't think I asked this question in Yud Gimel Midas. In Yisai Shvi, when the Rambam speaks about Nevuah's Moshe Rabbeinu, he emphasizes the fact that the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu reached the highest level of intellect that any person could possibly reach. Even though the Gilsa that I have in front of me, which comes from Ashas, doesn't speak really so much about Seichel, it implies Seichel, but if you look at the proper translation in Rav Shilat, you'll see that there it speaks about Moshe Rabbeinu reached the highest level of intellect that any person will ever reach. Midcha min ha-noishi is a lashon of the Rambam. Moshe Rabbeinu reached the highest level of intellect, he reached the level of malachim. That doesn't mean he had wings, but rather it means that he reached the highest level of intellect. On the other hand, in Yesod HaShmini, the Rambam says exactly the opposite. Moshe Rabbeinu is a sofer. Sofer shekoin levu koisev. He's sitting and just writing a text. These two things have nothing to do with each other. Why would you need the greatest intellect in history to copy over a text? But based on what I'm saying, we have two aspects of Nevuah's Moshe Rabbeinu. Yisai Shvi is speaking about the oral transmission, the Chidushei Torah Kiviyachol, the Moshe Rabbeinu apprehends of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is later placed into a text. Al Pi HaGevura. And for that, one requires the greatest intellect that ever was, will ever will be. But on the other hand, if we're speaking about the redaction of texts, it's very, very important. There's a hakpada. The Torah wants to emphasize. I wants to emphasize that these texts are exactly the texts that were apprehended by Moshe Rabbeinu. He didn't tamper with them. And for that, when we speak about the redaction of text, very much like the Rebbe's Mishnah, even though Rebbe redacted the Mishnah, he was very, very makbid of the lashon of the Mishnah to preserve the original language in which they were transmitted. From this, we need what the Rambam says: "Sofer shekoin levu koisev al sofer shekoin lei," a scribe. So, in other words, the two aspects of Moshe Rabbeinu were expressed in these two dimensions of the writing of the Torah. Okay, now the fact is that this leads to a very, very interesting understanding of Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah, which is in fact actually discussed in detail by the Mekubalim. In fact, it is, in my opinion, a very fundamental machloikis dispute between Reb Tzadok HaKohen and the Gra, and the Vilna Gaon. And this is going to be the subject of the next shiur. We're going to actually look at the understanding of Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah. Rabbi Shmuel, of course, is known to be the Bechin of Das, Seid HaDas, Moshe Rabbeinu, which is Bezavek Chochma and Bina. And we're going to see two ways of understanding this. One is going to be in Reb Tzadok and Resisei Laila. Another place is going to be in the Gra, in the Safed Tzneosa. And these two understandings of the Bechin of Das are actually going to be another way in which we're going to actually see expressed these two aspects of Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah apprehension and the writing of the Torah. Okay? That will be your mission for next time.
Can just before Rav Shutz,
yeah.
just again, just to say, the way Rav Shutz is now explained Rabbi Yochanan, what is the machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan?
There isn't a machlokas. Rabbi Yochanan, there were two things that took place. There was an oral transmission. There was two aspects of...
the May Nafka mean, according to both of them, the redaction was the end of 40 years. which you have to say.
Right. In other words, we got to see the redaction in two ways.
So what's the nafkamina about whether it was Megillah and Nitchna?
We'll see. When we get to actual examples, we're going to see that. But for example, this gives us the tools. Tikkun soferim is example of the first type of redaction.
But both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish agreed there was.
Fine, there's not a machlokes. I think Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, if you actually look at the text of the Gemara, it's not much that they're arguing. The Gemara makes a machlokes, but I'm saying that the original machlokes stands independent of that. It is not really machlokes because not everyone seems to be speaking to each other.
And the difference would be whether the original Megillas were written or just.
I think all we're seeing over here is two ways in which we understand the Chumash. We can understand the Chumash in two different types of ways. This is Chazal's understanding of the Chumash. Sometimes you understand the Chumash as being a text which emerges from an oral transmission. Sometimes you understand the text as being a redaction. So, for example, Ein Mucha Mukta B'Torah is a way in which you understand a redaction. Tikkun Soferim is a way in which we understand a text of oral tradition. In other words, Chazal are not interested in history. I think we established this several times. They couldn't kill us about history. Chazal are interested in maybe modus vivendi, or in other words, how are we supposed to understand the way the Chumash operates? And in fact, we're going to see in Mitzvah Hashem that Chazal actually based themselves upon the way they understood the Chumash operates, which means we're going to show how Chazal really, what they are is what they claim to be, the true transmitters of the tradition that comes from the Torah Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay? Until next time, from an undisclosed place in Yerushalayim, Kodesh, Kol Tuv.